So my word is utopia, which is spelled U-T-O-P-I-A. Utopia is a word which the Oxford English Dictionary describes as an imagined perfect place or state of things. So in that sense, utopia is something that has almost been with us since the beginning of human culture. All sort of civilizations have myths and legends about some kind of perfect place in the past, before conflicts, before economic or social inequalities. You can consider, for example, the Garden of Eden in the Bible as a form of utopia, this paradisial place where there was no sin. So the word utopia itself was actually invented by Sir Thomas More, the famous Renaissance humanist and statesman, notorious for his falling out with Henry VIII, who eventually executed him. But before that unfortunate incident in 1516, More created this word for a book entitled Utopia. And the word is derived from the ancient Greek, from ou, which means no, and topos, T-O-P-O-S, which means place. So the word essentially means no place, but it also has associations with another Greek word, eu, similar in sound, but spelled eu, which means good. So the word utopia from its beginnings means both good place and no place, and this perhaps gets to one of the kind of central contradictions of this word, which is that this kind of idea that good places are always somewhere else, or indeed nowhere. So we perhaps get this sense in which utopia is always a word which is associated with sort of human aspirations towards social perfection, but also the realisation of the limitations of that aspiration. And More's book itself perhaps captures some of those ambiguities. The first half involves More himself, who kind of puts himself into his narrative, meeting this traveller figure called Raphael Hythloday. And then the second half of the book goes into this figure, Hythloday, telling us about this amazing land that he's been to on his travels, this land of utopia, where everything is apparently much better. We have no social or economic inequality. There are long descriptions of how this perfect society supposedly works. People have often argued about whether it's a utopia which is intended seriously or not. The figure of Raphael Hythloday himself, his very name suggests some of the ambivalences surrounding this idea of a perfect society, because Raphael is both a reference to a figure of a divine messenger within the Bible, but the name Hythloday means a talker of nonsense. So he is both this divine idiot, and in that sense we're not quite sure how reliable he is, I suppose. So one of the important things to bear in mind about early modern utopias, such as that by Thomas More, is that they're very often set in the present. But what begins to change, particularly in the 18th century, is that utopias begin to be projected into the future. They become described as Uchronias by many critics. This is spelled E-U-C-H-R-O-N-I-A, which means a future good place, in effect. Utopianism, in many ways, comes of age in the late 19th century. This is the great period of utopian writing. And this is perhaps ironic because moving into the 20th century, we begin to get the emergence of a kind of alternative strand, particularly in the science fiction genre, of thinking about dystopia. And dystopia is, quite simply, I suppose, the kind of counterpoint, the opposite of utopia. Dystopia is the bad place. So we increasingly get writers imagining the kind of worst sort of societies that it's possible to come up with. The rise of totalitarianism, the rise of fascism and communism, many writers responding to these movements by thinking about what a fully communist or fascist society might look like, which of course, you know, comes to fruition in Nazi Germany and eventually in Soviet Russia. So we get figures like Aldous Huxley, perhaps most famously, and George Orwell, writing books like Brave New World in 1984, these visions of Big Brother, of all-controlling totalitarian societies. And this is a tradition which, you know, is perhaps inaugurated in some ways by a figure like H.G. Wells, writing slightly earlier, who in many ways kind of pioneers science fiction as the central utopian, dystopian genre. So if you think about a book like Wells's The Time Machine, the narrator discovers that this perfect society he's visiting in the future is actually based on a system of slavery, that these primitive creatures called the Morlocks are actually doing all the labour which makes this perfect society possible. And in Wells's case, this has a lot to do with eugenics. He's very interested in social Darwinism, and this trend obviously becomes kind of more negative, I suppose, in terms of Nazi obsessions with eugenics and kind of creating perfect societies by removing unwanted elements of that society. So, you know, the Holocaust is perhaps the most potent example of a dystopia in practice. Another resurgence of utopianism with the 1960s, the rise of social liberalism, and particularly if you think about hippies who are very keen on setting up communes and talking about kind of their version of perfect social relationships, free love. And then through to the sort of 1970s, we get the emergence, particularly interestingly, of what's often called eco-topias, which is a form of utopia very much oriented around a sense of your relationship to your environment. But as we kind of move into the present moment, it's perhaps a sense in which utopia is somewhat of a conflicted or maybe even a dying term. There are perhaps two main reasons that people have made this argument. The first is precisely the failure of some of those kinds of 1960s social movements, the failure of the hippie dream, but also the failure of kind of social liberalism in the 1980s with the rise of conservatism, Reagan and Thatcher and so forth. So, you know, this idea of an idealistic society of freer gender relations, more kind of economic equality, is one which has been much challenged in the later 20th century. And the other kind of strand of threat to utopia, I suppose, which people have often talked about, is the fall of communism. Communism was a kind of idea of a social structure or a social relationship which had a definite utopian quality. It was striving towards a notion of perfection and equal distribution of wealth. So coming into the 21st century, there's a sense among some people of great pessimism, I suppose, about the idea of utopia, the idea that maybe utopia, as I've been talking about, isn't actually ever possible, that we can only ever strive towards it and never achieve it. And I'd argue that you need two things for a utopia. Firstly, you need somewhere for this to happen. If we go back to Thomas More's definition of the word, his use of the word topos, place, utopias are always specifically tied to a place, whether it's a place that you imagine or a place that you create here on Earth. The world no longer has these undiscovered places like the New World as it was in the 16th century. Perhaps something like the internet is a new utopian space. Certainly there's a way in which when the internet first appeared, many saw it as a place where new kind of equal social relationships might happen, a place to kind of expand the parameters of democracy. Things like Sims, or at the moment things like Second Life, these are places on the internet where people are kind of reimagining themselves, where they're imagining whole kind of social structures, new forms of social interaction. And so, as I've said, one key thing we need is a place, and perhaps there still is a place there. The other key thing I think you need for utopia, or the key reason why utopia has kind of appeared and persisted in human culture, is because utopia is a response to social and economic inequality, to gender inequality, to any form of inequality you care to imagine. And in this sense, it's important to emphasise that utopias have always appeared as responses to the contemporary moment in which the writers of these utopias were living. They're always, although they may be set in the future, commentaries on the present, and particularly on the kinds of ills that these writers see around them. And in the sense that we're not likely ever to escape from various forms of inequality, I think it's safe to say that utopias will continue to have a certain appeal, and that people will continue to be drawn to these forms of imagining perfect places and perfect societies.